Good evening, everyone. It is 5 o'clock. Welcome to the town's Oversight, Pension and Oversight Committee agenda for September 3rd. Can I get a roll call, please?
Thank you and good evening. Councilmember Syock.
Here.
Councilmember Rennie.
Here.
Councilmember Spector.
Here.
Vice Mayor Jensen.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Leonardis.
Here. So our first item on the agenda this evening is our consent calendar. Does any member of council need to pull anything from that agenda? Seeing none, does any member of the public wish to pull anything from consent? Seeing none, can I get a vote? Vice Mayor.
I move to approve the consent calendar consisting of items 1 through 3.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None. Next up is verbal communications for items which are not on the agenda this evening. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak on anything which is not on the consent calendar, or on the regular agenda, excuse me? We have none. We will move on to our first item of business, our only item of business, item number 4, which is review and discuss the CalPERS 2017 actuarial valuations for the miscellaneous safety and pension plans, and decide on an additional discretionary payment strategy based on the August 2019 Bartle and Associates analysis. Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As the staff report illustrates, both this body and the Finance Committee have been in deliberations about what's referred to as additional discretionary payment strategies, which is how do we deploy the monies which this council, through their budgetary actions, has acquired to try and mitigate and pay down the unfunded liabilities associated with the town's pension plans. In doing so, the Finance Committee at their last meeting, with analysis from Bartel, and Joe D'Onforio from Bartel is here tonight to help with a presentation that we'll do briefly, presented analysis related to the 3 main categories of ADPs. The staff report, in addition to 2 other staff reports, and the full analysis is in the packet. But with that, if it's okay, we'd like to just move to a brief presentation to set context for the discussion tonight. The beginning part I'll present, it'll be related to the actual unfunded liability and their review of the 2017 actuarial reports. And then Joe will move us into the ADP discussion, set it up, and then from there, we'll see where the conversation goes and if folks would like additional clarification on any aspects of the reports. So you'll notice throughout the reports, there's a lot of references to 6%. And so for our individuals who aren't on the Finance Committee, you might recall that CalPERS is lowering the discount rate to 7%. So you might wonder, why are we having a lot of slides that illustrate 6%? Well, one of the reasons we're doing that is, in addition to the lowering of the discount rate, CalPERS has also adopted what they refer to their risk mitigation strategy. And what the risk mitigation strategy is designed to do, it's to address some very specific issues related to the CalPERS plan overall, not necessarily Los Gatos, not necessarily Milpitas, but to the overall, what they refer to as the PERF fund. And what they're doing is they're trying to address a couple things. One, they have a very mature fund, and so they don't want to expose the assets to a lot of volatility. And so one of the ways you do that is by lowering the equity allocation and getting a lower risk profile. One of the other things they're trying to address is the fact that they're trying to dampen contribution volatility for folks just like ourselves. Whenever we get a new actuarial report and it shows, big swings in contributions, that's hard for us to budget, and so they're trying to maintain a smoother contribution level going forward. The way they do this is over the course of the next several decades, when they have gains greater than the discount rate of what is currently 7%, they're going to use some of those gains to basically buy down risk. If they have gains that they think they can lower the discount rate from 7% to 6 7/8 or 6 3/4, they've got a whole method of how they're going to do it. They're going to do it. But the objective is to continue lowering the discount rate below 7. And as you'll see from the Bartel analysis, the expectation is over the next decade or 2, we expect them to get to a 6% discount rate. So as I mentioned, you'll start to see references to 6% in a lot of reports. When Bartel did their analysis of the 2017 valuation, they were able to take data that CalPERS doesn't provide us with and aggregate it together, because we have both the miscellaneous and the safety plan. And as you can see here, when you take a 7% discount rate and you look at the joint plans, miscellaneous and safety together, you see that we have an unfunded liability combined of roughly 58 million and a combined funded status of roughly 70% or 69.6. If they then go take that and expose it to a 6% discount rate, you can see that unfunded liability for both plans goes from roughly 58 million to approximately 83 million, and you can see that our funded status drops from roughly 70% to about 61, 62%. In addition to looking at where we are at a moment in time in terms of funded status and unfunded actuarial liability, Bartel is also able to take their data and extrapolate it further for projections than what CalPERS currently provides. CalPERS provides us with 5 years of projections, and Bartel is able to take that out to a 10-year period. You can see in this slide that out over a 10-year period, when you combine both miscellaneous and safety once again, which is the blue line, this is information we've known that we're going to have increasing pension payments over the course of the next 5 years. That is currently in our budget, and then over the course of 10 years, which has been communicated prior by CalPERS. One of the interesting things from the presentation from Bartel is they are not wedded to the assumptions that CalPERS has, and so when they do these projections, they actually end up using about a 6.5% blended return as opposed to the current 7%. So not only does this give us a better forward projection over a 10-year period, but it does it at a 6.5 roughly discount rate as opposed to the current 7. If we take that last line and we add in our Opeb obligations, which we know are roughly $2 million a year, once again, you can see that it's expected that our total payments will move in a vicinity of about $13 million per year out a decade from now. Once again, $5 million of this, not necessarily at the 6.5% discount rate, more in line with CalPERS projections, is already in our budget documents. But once again, if we were to assume a lower discount rate, and if we were to take it out longer in time, you can see the expectation is that we still have increasing pension obligations for the next decade. With that, the main dialogue that occurred at the Finance Committee, and the one that we're here to discuss primarily tonight, is this concept of additional discretionary payments. And there are 3 primary ways that we can take roughly $8.2 million. And I will add, we talk a lot about the 8.2 because we have the existing money in PARS, and then this council, through their budgetary actions, added another $3.2 million in the last budget cycle. I will add that in a prior policy adjustment, the council had taken action to reduce our amortization from a 30-year to a 20-year. That'll probably add roughly another $400,000. So even though we'll talk a lot about 8.2 million, in the back of your minds, you should know it's probably closer to 8.6. So there are 3 primary ways to do ADPs. The first is to give payments directly to CalPERS. The next is to continue giving payments to the Pension 115 Trust, or to continue giving payments into the Opeb Trust. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joe if you want to join us at the dais.
Hi, good evening. I'm Joe D'Onofrio with Bartel Associates, and we assist you in reviewing the
Could you make sure that the microphone is pulled closer and on?
Oh, is it on? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. My name is Joe D'Onofrio. I'm an actuary with Bartel Associates. So the slide we have up there now, if you were to send additional funds to CalPERS, they're going to ask you how to apply it. And the unfunded liability that you're paying off is a series of pieces that arise every year based on when CalPERS changes their assumptions or when you have things like an investment gain or loss. And these are spread out over a number of years. The old ones, there are just a few years left, and the new ones, there's a lot of years left. So if you went to CalPERS and told them to pay off the shorter bases, what that would do is impact your contribution quicker because it would affect the next few years. If you asked them to pay off some of those longer bases that are left, it'd be spread out, the $8 million would be spread out over a longer period of time. So an agency that wanted to impact the contribution very quickly would choose to pay off a shorter base. one that was trying to save more of the interest they pay on the unfunded would target the longer bases. So that shorter bases, we pick the shortest bases, and what we have there is contribution savings, just means the interest you wouldn't be paying at 7%. It's 3.7 million. If we targeted the longest basis, it would be 11 million, over 11. That's because the interest is being paid over a longer period of time. The last column, we just tried to turn those numbers into, dollars today by discounting them at 3%. For example, like inflation, it's better to compare it in today's dollars. So targeting shorter bases would lower the contribution quicker for agencies that are worried about the next few years' contributions. Targeting the longer bases would save you more in terms of interest and the contribution over the long term. Any questions about this one? Okay. So when you set up a 115 trust, you move the money from the town's assets into a trust where you could, assuming to get a higher investment earnings and by taking more risk. So I think you've chosen, right now you've chosen a very aggressive fund. That's good for long term. Some agencies that set up a 115 trust and are thinking about using the contributions in the short term, maybe they're thinking, gee, we have some extra cash now, but we're not so sure about 3, 4, 5 years out. So we want to use the money at that time, would choose a more conservative investment mix so that your money is still there when CalPERS's money may be going down. If you're investing for the long term and don't expect to use the funds right away, you can take a longer, more investment risk. And that's what I read in your agenda, that possibly the town doesn't think it might have the same reasons as CalPERS to get conservative in the future. So maybe you want to be more risky and have the opportunity to get a higher return by keeping the money in a 115 trust. The 115 assets can only be used to fund the pension plan. They cannot be diverted to some other use. And if you're worried about accounting and financial statements, they will not show as an asset to the pension plan on your financial statement when you show the unfunded liability. It will be on your financial statement somewhere, but the accounting doesn't directly include them to offset the liabilities.
Mr. Rennie, you have a question?
I do have a question on that. So you said the 115 fund should be used if we're thinking long-term, but you didn't really define long-term. You define what bad term would be, 3 to 5 years. So if we said, yes, we want to be long-term, can you pick a number? Does that mean we shouldn't withdraw from it for 10 years, 15 years? How do we define long-term?
Yes, so what I'm not is an investment advisor, okay, but
But you use the term long-term, must mean something
from my
to you.
perspective, if you're putting the money aside to fund the pension plan, you might want it there when you need it. So if CalPERS has a 20% loss in their assets and you have a 20% loss in the 115 trust, you might feel like it's not serving its purpose. So if you're thinking, gee, we want to use that money 4 or 5 years from now, we better not be as risky as CalPERS is, because we want that money to be there to be able to use it when CalPERS raises their contributions.
So maybe what we do is every year we say, are we going to need this money in the next 5 years? No. Okay, keep
Right.
it there. Next year, do we need this in the next 5 years? No, keep it there.
Right.
Do we need this in the next 5 years? Oops, maybe. So then we make a change.
I think so, but if you're just thinking, hey, we can get better return than CalPERS in the long term, you're probably thinking 20 years or more out,
Okay,
that you're going to let it sit there and work for you.
thanks.
And I'll just add, at the Finance Committee level, they seem to define long-term as 10 years and greater.
Okay, so this is the Opeb plan. There's a lot of numbers here, but if you look at the first 2 rows going across, the funded percent in the OPEB plan was 61% around 6/30/19, or be 6/30/18. And if you put the 8 million there, if you put an additional 8 million there, it wouldn't come from the 115 trust, but it would come from funds you might have been allocating to CalPERS and then use the 8 for CalPERS. The funded percent would go to like 94%. So it would be almost 100% funded by putting the 8 million in there. And over the next 10 years, it would get that extra 4 or 5% to 100% funded.
And so, right, sorry, Mayor.
So the question is, if the $8 million was put towards OPEB, what would be the opportunity in interest saved? In other words, versus putting it towards CalPERS, what would be the return, the immediate return on an annual basis?
Assuming is, I believe, 6.75% versus CalPERS 7.
That's correct. So similar to the illustrative analysis we did on the previous slide, there would be interest savings associated with this. I will caveat a little bit what Joe said, in the sense that in the staff report it mentions that depending on what option is chosen, staff will definitely have recommendations on implementation. If this body were to decide that they like the OPEB strategy, and if it were to take it in a 90-plus funded status, staff would recommend, and with the OPEB plan, you have full authority over moving that asset allocation. Staff would recommend reducing the asset allocation because there's no reason to have that type of equity/risk exposure when you're already so fully funded. And so that would lower the numbers a little, I believe, Joe, if we were to go to either CERBT2 or CERBT3. And so it would still be the highest funded plan. There would still be interest savings associated with the plan, and there would still be contribution savings similar to the pension illustration, but they'd be slightly less than what's being illustrated here.
Councilmember Sayoc?
So I have two questions. The first, on the previous slide, you mentioned one of the benefits is overfunding. And so the first question is if you could please elaborate what's considered overfunding. And then the second, moving to the OPEB, is that a scenario of overfunding?
Okay, so when CalPERS years ago had some years where they told agencies they didn't need to put a contribution in at all because they were over 100% funded. And the PEPRA law prevents that. So agencies always have to make a normal cost contribution. That's a contribution that accrues every year for active employees to put aside money for their benefits at retirement. So even if the plan is over 100% funded, you still have to send that money to CalPERS. So if you have the money in the 115 trust, the CalPERS plan won't be 100% funded, let's say, because you have the money over here in the 115 trust that CalPERS is not looking at. So the CalPERS plan might not be 100% funded, and then you would have that normal cost contribution. But if it got overfunded in total, you wouldn't have to make that contribution to the 115 trust. If CalPERS was over 100%, you'd have to put that normal cost to CalPERS. If combined it was over 100%, you would not have to put it into the 115 trust. So it avoids putting too much money in the combined plans, the two.
And then I'll answer your OPEB question. So if it were to go to the OPEB trust, and then staff were to recommend lowering the asset allocation to a less risky allocation, it would be somewhere in the probably mid-80 vicinity. One of the differences is, unlike CalPERS, who, when they determine the annual required contribution, it's pretty much mandated, for good governance that you pay the recommended contribution. With the OPEB plan, it's been more of an internal policy because we started at 0% funding. And so in that case, you would now be in a position where if you wanted to revert back to a pay-go status because you have funded this plan so well, you would have that latitude. You wouldn't necessarily have to keep funding it and go over 100%. So with that, we wanted to just do a brief presentation to set the context. As you know, before you this evening is a staff report that explained kind of the discussions that took place at the Finance Committee. As the report stated, there was no consensus coming out of the Finance Committee in terms of a single recommendation. There were definite areas where committee members gravitated towards. In addition, we have, the exact slide presentation here from the Finance Committee, and then a broader presentation about the whole actuarials. And so myself and Joe are here to, just see where you want the conversation to go, guide you towards information and analysis that will help with that part of the conversation. But at that point, this does conclude our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. We have a question. Councilmember Rennie.
So I'd like to take the discussion, sounds like you're asking for that, towards your comment here about if we do make contributions to the PARs, it's talking about codifying so that future elected officials understand they're not supposed to be pulling money out too quickly. So what does codify mean? And I ask you now so that also maybe some of the speakers will speak to that also.
And that's a great question, because the reality is codifying means that this council could adopt a policy that we could embed either in the policy for the general fund at the end of the year, or we could embed it in the existing investment policy for this body. We could look to embed an approved policy by this council in several areas, but any future council could overturn that action. And this was one of the main, not main elements, but it was one of the areas where there seemed to be consensus at the Finance Committee, that concern that, this governing body, with the analysis and information you have from your committee members, that you have from staff, that you have from your consultants, you make a decision that ultimately could be overturned. And that relates directly back to the whole conversation about if the PARS is intended to try and capture historic long-term returns in equities that are superior to other asset classes, that strategy is viable if the monies stay there for a long period of time. If this council or future councils decide, well, you know what, we thought we were going to be able to stay the course, but now we might need this money for budgetary relief, and you decide to shift gears, then you have the wrong risk profile in the PARS account right now. And so that's where kind of the toggle is. If this council or future councils are concerned that you may not be able to stay the course for a long term and capture that higher equity return, then we probably need to rethink the asset allocation that we're currently in PARS. Or, as was discussed at the Finance Committee, perhaps we don't even necessarily need PARS. Perhaps the money should either go directly to CalPERS, or perhaps the money should go directly to Opeb.
So let me continue with that, with an idea that I developed just listening here. Could we do something like write a policy that says we can't withdraw money out of the PARS account unless we give a 5-year warning? So for, like I said, we're checking each year and we say, oh, we think we're going to need this in 5 years. So we then say, here's our 5-year warning per policy. And then I assume what staff would then do is say, okay, they're going to need this in 5 years. Let's move it to a lower asset allocation. But it's got to stay in PARS, just at a lower asset allocation, because we're saying we don't want to withdraw it. But I'm thinking it as a way so council can't just go grab it quickly. They actually have to look forward and be strategic about it.
We could. There is some concern just based from an asset allocation and investment management standpoint of having an option to change your asset allocation annually, especially if you're conceiving of a long-term position. You don't necessarily want to think that you have an option every year to change that asset allocation. I understand, I think, the rationale that you're getting at, which is you want to make sure that if a future council is going to consider doing it, they're kind of forced to wait and think about what they're going to do. So in terms, once again, of implementation, it would depend on if a council says, oh, okay, this is the year that we want to trigger that caveat. If it's a bad year, which is why they're saying it, and then you switch your asset allocation at that point in time, you might be de-equitizing a portfolio at the worst possible time.
And obviously the idea would be that they couldn't grab it quickly, and and they'd have to be looking forward. But I'll let Councilmember Jensen ask.
Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to follow up to that, when I hear the word codified, I think ordinance, and what I'm hearing is policy. So I just want to confirm with all of you that what we're talking about is potentially, with Mr. Rennie's line of questioning, a policy which the council has the discretion to change at any time. So even if we said 5-year warning, then the council could go, in 2 weeks from now, it could be not that, because a policy is something that just gets adopted by the council.
That's a good point of clarification. If we wanted to try and make the concept of codification stronger, we could definitely move into an ordinance.
Okay,
okay,
I want to follow up on that.
I said
interesting.
definite, and I'm about to
I
qualify
had
that by
no
saying,
idea
can our
that
town
you-
attorney opine
I had
on
no
that?
idea that you could do an ordinance on budgeting. Can you do that? Okay, you're shaking your head no. I didn't
Okay.
think so. Right, okay.
Okay. Other questions, other commentary? Seeing none, I can open it up to the public. Mr. Rick Tinsley, followed by Mr. Lee Fago.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, council members. I'd like to give a sort of a little background discussion on sort of how we got here, remind everyone, maybe put in perspective. And then I have some very, very specific recommendations that I will urge the council to specifically take action on in this meeting. For many years, the town has accumulated excess cash in an unusual and complicated collection of reserve accounts, earning sub-inflation rates of return, which means we've actually been losing taxpayer money in real dollar terms because inflation is gradually eating away at our large stockpiles of cash. And they are large stockpiles of cash by most measures relative to other municipalities in California or anywhere else for that matter. We've until very recently avoided committing significant excess cash to long-term capital appreciation investments, which could ultimately make a substantial dent in our $90 million and growing pension liability. And yes, I'm intentionally saying $90 million. All the numbers in the Bartell account are 2 years old, and I'm willing to bet anyone right now $20 that 2 years from now, when we'll have this same meeting, and we will have the same meeting 2 years from now, the numbers from this year will be well over $90 million in total in terms of pension liability. So to use a consumer analogy, which I think everyone can readily understand, this would be just like maxing out your credit cards and accumulating 18% APR interest rates, while at the same time stuffing bags full of $100 bills under your mattress, rather than taking some of those $100 bills and maybe paying down that credit card debt. Now, I think most people with a basic understanding of prudent money management would not make that same mistake, but that's exactly what the town of Los Gatos has been doing for many, many years. Over the past 3 years that I've been involved with the Finance Committee, it's become very apparent to me that the town has a significant institutional bias in favor of stuffing cash under the mattress, as opposed to making what I think should be rather obvious long-term financial decisions, capital appreciation-oriented financial decisions. The entire discussion around rate stabilization is just the latest example of this. This town already has completely ample rate stabilization insurance in the form of our various redundant and overlapping general fund reserves. We should not be confusing a $90 million and growing pension liability that our taxpayers will be paying off for many decades to come with the need to find a few $1 million at some point to smooth over revenue blips during a recession. That latter is a short-term problem that's going to happen from time to time, but we're more than adequately reserved for that through our existing very ample general fund reserves, whereas the pension problem is a permanent and growing liability that's orders of magnitude larger in size. So although I was initially one of the most vocal proponents of the 115 Pension Trust because it offered a financial diversification, as so we wouldn't have all our eggs in the CalPERS basket, as well as the potential for higher long-term returns due to higher equity exposure, it's clear to me now.
Could you please finish your comment, and then
Very
we'll see if you have
It's
questions.
clear to me now that there'll always be someone in town who will want to fiddle with the objective of a trust, a long-term investment trust, and use it for another short-term reserve. And this is the last thing that we'd want to do. I think that Mr. Andrews sort of hinted at this. Pulling your money out of a long-term equity-heavy investment strategy during a downturn would be financial mismanagement at its worst. So therefore, I urge the council to do the following. I'll suggest 4 things in particular. Number 1, make a $3.2 million ADP to CalPERS with the cash that was mentioned that's currently sitting idle in our general fund, earning less than the rate of inflation. Number 2, make an additional ADP to CalPERS with the full fund balance that's currently in the 115 pension trust and close that trust. I no longer have confidence that we are capable of using that trust in a financially prudent long-term fashion, so we should get rid of it, eliminate it from our decision-making so that we can stay focused on fewer, simpler options and move forward with paying down our liability. Number 3, expect and plan to make similar multi-million-dollar ADPs every year for at least the next 10 years. This is not going away. We're going to keep having this meeting every year for at least another decade, maybe a lot longer than that. Number 4, direct the Finance Committee to resume work on recommendations to rationalize and streamline our current general fund reserve policy to be more in line with best practices of other municipalities. This is going to be critical to funding some of those future ADPs, which we're going to have to make in subsequent years. Thank you. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Mr. Tinsley. Questions from council? I will ask you a question. So your number 2 point, first point, 3.2 million to CalPERS immediately. Second is take the whole balance of the 115 as it exists and throw it right at CalPERS now and basically close the 115. Don't even leave it open with $1, just completely shutter it.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. Councilmember Rennie.
So you gave us an example of mismanagement of, bags of money under the mattress, but wouldn't it also be mismanagement to go take all that money and throw it in the stock market at its peak and watch 20, 30% disappear potentially in the next 2-3 years?
Certainly. I don't think anyone's suggesting that.
Well, okay, so you're thinking 3.2 plus, well, the other's already in the market, so that's okay, right? The PARs to PERS, but the 3.2 you don't consider very large then?
It's 3% of our total liability right now, and it'll be a lot less than that in a few years.
So it's not like throwing the whole bag into the market then?
We have $70 million in cash in the bank.
Okay.
Very, very healthy town from a cash standpoint.
Thanks.
Vice Mayor.
It's not a question for Mr. Tinsley, it's actually a follow-up on one of your suggestions for the town. If we were to follow Mr. Tinsley's recommendation and basically dissolve the 115 trust, does this oversight committee dissolve?
Oh, meaning, thank you.
We're
With this committee,
sitting
does
as OPEB Trust Oversight Committee. I thought that was associated with the 115. If we no longer have a 115, is this oversight committee also gone?
It would not. One of the primary reasons for that is the actual OPEB trust is one of the vehicles where you actually have some of the most fiduciary responsibility, because not only do you control the assets in there and the asset allocation, but you actually control the actuarial assumptions. When Bartel and Associates makes recommendations, like for instance, last year we moved the discount rate in the OPEB plan from 7 and 6 3/4. This body actually adopted the discount rate, unlike the pension assets with CalPERS. And so this body would still stay in existence, but you would probably discuss primarily the OPEB from that point forward, and then if the council were to create additional budgetary savings that they wanted directed towards unfunded liabilities, you would probably also discuss that. But depending on what comes out of this discussion tonight, you might set a precedent for future ADPs.
Thank you.
Question for Mr. Tinsley. So you talked about putting all the money towards CalPERS. What would be the advantage of doing that versus funding the OPEB?
Our liability at CalPERS is, it's known, it's growing. It's more than 10 times the amount of liability that we can even conceive of in the OPEB trust. So it's a much bigger problem. The OPEB liability, especially with the recent change we made last year with the new contracts where new employees aren't going to get lifetime health care, that's not going to continue to grow indefinitely. There's also a lot of regulatory issues at the federal level that may end up taking priority over what we think that liability. So there's a lot of questions around what the long-term OPEB liability really will be, but we know it's a lot smaller than our pension liability. it may be subject to other changes that we can't foresee now. And it's already actually substantially better funded than our pension liability is. The pension liability is real, and it's not going to go away. There's no federal regulations or bailouts or anything like that that's going to change, or changes of healthcare systems, Medicare for all and whatnot, which could have a huge impact on OPEB liability. None of that's going to change the pension liability. So it's a order of magnitude larger and known and definitely growing liability. And we know it's growing because CalPERS continues to underperform the discount rates that all these calculations are based on. So every year for many, many years, when you see these numbers, they're going to be bigger than they were last year. And that's guaranteed at this point, unless CalPERS suddenly magically starts earning, 8 or 10% per year on a sustained basis.
So being that we're all in this together with CalPERS, everyone in California, every jurisdiction, for the most part, what is the end game? I mean, if you put $8 million towards CalPERS now, yes, it lowers your overall unfunded pension liabilities. Maybe it will lower the amount of interest you have to pay in the short run.
Well, I mean, let's use the financial crisis as a model. During the financial crisis, some individuals became bankrupt. Some businesses became bankrupt.
You're talking about the Great Recession?
Yeah, the Great Recession, what happened 11 years ago. The same thing's going to happen. There'll be haves and have-nots. We're a have town. We have $70 million in the bank. We're not going to go bankrupt. But we're going to have to end up spending a lot of that $70 million over time to pay the pension obligation that the town council has, already granted our employees. Our employees, deserve those pensions. That was part of the deal. So that's going to happen. Other towns that don't have those resources will go bankrupt. And there's only been a few cases of this to date, like Vallejo and San Bernardino and Stockton, but there'll be dozens and dozens in the next recession. And then there'll be dozens and dozens more, perhaps hundreds more in the next recession after that. And so there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. In many of those towns, you're going to see massive cutbacks in services. They're going to become, much less pleasant places to live. There'll be fewer employees that work for those towns. They won't have the quality of services that they used to have. And some employees may end up taking a bath on some of their benefits that they were promised if those towns can't perform. That's not going to happen here. At least I can't conceive that, because we are, again, we've got bags full of $100 bills under the mattress. But we can do a better job of putting some of those bags, not all of the bags, but some of those bags of $100 bills to work to minimize how many $100 bills we actually have to spend on this problem over the long term.
Do you see this as a zero-sum game in the end? In other words, it seems to me when you look at the CalPERS, every time you read an article about it, it's like doomsday. They keep moving the goalposts. I read an article just today about the city of Sacramento, where they just raised taxes by $50 million to provide a whole bunch of new services. They passed a ballot initiative, and they have an additional $47 million payment. So it's going to be a wash, essentially.
We did the same thing last year.
Well, so what I'm saying is...
Still much healthier than Sacramento.
So as we're at 7% and it's projected to go to 6%, I mean, I guess, what other options are there?
There aren't. Eventually, there'll be so many towns that fail. that might prompt real pension reform, that might sort of create the political will to change some of the laws in California that really created this situation, where you might end up with a real retirement board. Like a lot of states have retirement boards that are truly objective, and they have fiduciary responsibilities to both employees and employers. CalPERS doesn't. CalPERS has no fiduciary obligation whatsoever to Los Gatos or any other employer. They only have a fiduciary obligation to the employees, the people that pay dues and get pensions. And California is rather unique in that regard, which is kind of why we have the problem in a more extreme case than many states do. But eventually, what changes, what creates, political will to actually make real reform? It's usually crisis, massive crisis. And so I don't know when that'll happen, but it'll probably happen eventually.
Some food for thought, thank you. Next speaker, Leafa Go, followed by Terry Duryea.
I've provided a handout. You may not need to take a look at it, because it's hard to follow Mr. Tinsley. He spoke very well. I endorse everything he said, his perspective, the information, the knowledge he brings, help to put the right kind of balance into the thinking that we need to do going forward. However, with the notes that I've given you, I'm going to abbreviate what's there. The first thing to think of is that for every active town employee, we have 146, there are 2 retirees with whom we have a financial obligation. This currently totals 440 folks to whom we have obligated ourselves. Currently, we are paying out $2 million more in benefits than the amount collected into our pension fund for the miscellaneous employees only, and trending higher with the difference compounding yearly since payouts come sooner given the large number of retirees and the longer life expectancy of folks and the worse earnings performance than originally projected by CalPERS. While the town's contributions rate have increased, both in dollars and in percentage, it is still only paying the CalPERS minimum, though the town created and distributed last year to the 115 Trust, which we've just spoken about, which you've just discussed. It has a different risk profile, and it has fees associated with it that CalPERS doesn't. But the 115 is committed to the pension trust, to the pension. The net effect is the town still has to meet the CalPERS minimum contributions, which continue to escalate. Further, that while the town has earmarked $8.6 million for payment into some committed pension plan, it has not done so far this year, and instead is just earning the current 1.7% interest rate, which is below the rate of inflation. The model of the sacks of money under the mattress is very on target. So what the town has earned is $141,000 at that 1.7% interest. If we had put it into CalPERS, we would have earned $580,000. This missed earnings could have paid this year's pension obligations alone for 5 retirees, that differential. So, in summary, please pay now the $8.3 million into the CalPERS plan. Pay it out over a 12-month period of time. You don't have to put it all in at once, but do write the check and send the money in. We've had this discussions now for almost 2 years, and we still haven't done what's necessary to pay into CalPERS. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fagot. So I'll ask you a question. Based on your analysis, you believe that if the opportunity cost of having, say, $8 million available but not being utilized towards paying towards CalPERS was about $400,000, the difference between, a little more than $400,000, the difference between the interest we actually earned at 1.7%
Correct.
versus what we would have saved by applying that $8 million towards CalPERS?
That is correct, and that would have paid the pension obligation for 5 miscellaneous retiree employees
All right,
for that
thank
period
you.
of time.
Mr. Rennie?
So you looked in the rearview mirror and said we should have done. If we look into the forward mirror, we might have a stock market crash and we might lose that $500,000 also if we put all the money in. We've had a lot of suggestions, none from here tonight, for that dollar cost averaging is the best way to go into the market, and then even some of the people in this room have mentioned that before. Why are we all of a sudden going to spend all the money that we've got kind of available for this all at once and throw away the whole dollar cost averaging?
No, I advocated for dollar cost averaging. That's what I'm saying. Over the next 12 months to pay into so that we spend that full $8.3 million.
Over 1 year.
Over 1 year. So that's the dollar cost averaging that I'm proposing. I didn't use that term, but that was over the 12 months. That's what I meant.
Okay.
Advertise it that way.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fagot. Terry Duryea. And then Jack Faunetas after Terry.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members.
Terry, if you can bring the microphone towards you.
and council members. I'm very glad you had Mr. Tinsley go first. I endorse the answers to his questions. My recommendation that I'll close off here is similar to his for the first two, although some detail, some differences in the implementation of the details that have already been addressed. I'm assuming you've read my memos. I know you guys are doing a lot of work. I'm going to just try to provide a summary. We know we have a big problem. Fund the obligations we made to our employees. We never talk about our obligations to our employees and our retired employees. We have not only a legal but a moral obligation. I acknowledge the town has already taken many actions. Mr. Andrews talked about changing the amortization from 30 to 20 years. A few years ago, we put $4 million. We had a one-time opportunity to put $4 million towards the safety pension plan. Council passed $300,000 a year if the funds are available to be supplementally added to the pension plan. We've set up the 115 trust, so we're doing a lot. In spite of this, we have not stopped the growth of the town's unfunded pension liability. I know you know this, but it's increasing almost every year. At the same time, the OPEB funded percentage has increased each year because the town has actually been built into the budget, a $1 million a year ADP. Nothing required, but the town is already making an ADP for the unfunded OPEB liability, and it's built into the 5-year budget to continue. I'm leading to why I support a simple solution. The Finance Committee, the Town Council, the Oversight Committee has spent time and energy debating the pros and cons of how to set the money aside to deal with an intractable problem. We want to give the town maximum flexibility and control over the assets. We got to make trade-offs. That's the problem here. That's what makes it so hard to make decisions. The cost, we've touched on it, the cost of the delay is, in the decision-making, I believe is a true cost to Los Gatos. As we have lost out on a strong stock market, that's hindsight, I understand that. There is no simple solution to meet these obligations. I would like to see the town take the extent of this annual debate off the table. And my recommendation is a simple solution. Make an ADP of the entire $8 million. The implementation will be different. 2 CalPERS to fund the unfunded pension liability, close down the 115 trust, move the $5 million in a 115 trust right across to CalPERS. Because the asset allocation, while different, isn't that wildly different. Then dollar cost average the $3.2 million that is in the town's cash reserves, dollar cost that over to CalPERS. That's it. I'm open to questions.
Questions for Mr. Delaray? Seeing none, so I will ask you a question. So Mr. Tinsley says, take all $8 million and throw it in there now. I'm just going to use $8 million, it's easier. Well, maybe Terry will answer. Mr. Fago says over 12 months, you say put all the 115 in now and then the 3.2 that is sitting in the cash, dollar cost average that. Maybe you can.
Yes, that's the point I was trying to make. We already have $5 million of the 8.2 invested under the 115 pension trust. So I don't see a great deal of benefit of taking 12 months to transfer that over, but I can't argue one versus the other. It may be more prudent to take that $5 million in the 115 trust and spend it over 12 months. I would defer to the town staff on that decision. And with respect to the $3 million that is in the town's balance sheet right now, I would dollar cost average that.
What would be the disadvantages of putting I'm just going to again use the $8 million, $8 million in now in one lump sum as opposed to taking $8 million and dividing it over time and putting in, I mean, when you guys say dollar cost average, if we pay it now in one lump sum, don't we immediately start saving the 7% or whatever against the CalPERS right away, as opposed to betting that the market will do better than that, or if the market does potentially worse, wouldn't we be coming out ahead?
I don't believe we should be gambling with the money. So as a risk mitigation strategy, I would spread that over 12 months. I mean, it's that simple. It could go down. And if it goes down, we can buy in month 3 and 4. If it keeps going down, we can buy more and more value at the lower prices. So don't put it all in at once, but you're effectively dollar cost averaging down in a down market. So I don't think we want to gamble with the town's assets. That's my simple answer.
Mr. Rennie?
So if we move over from PARS, I keep hearing that the PARS is a higher risk profile than CalPERS. So if we were, and your suggestion to move it over is it's already invested in the market, we're just going to move it, invest it somewhere else. It's not, you know, if it stayed there and the market went down, we'd get nailed. If we move it and over to PERS, and the market went down, we'd still get nailed. But actually, I think we're going to get nailed less if we move it over to PERS, because PERS is a lower equity fund. Is that, am I thinking about this correctly?
Yeah, I
So
agree with
you're
you.
actually de-risking by moving it all over now, to some extent.
Well, if it's going down, if it's going up, you're not getting the gains. And that's why I, not an investment professional, I'd leave it to town staff to decide how to fine-tune the money that currently is in the PARS 115 pension trust.
Fine-tune moving it.
Yeah, the timing of fine-tuning it,
Yeah,
doing it
okay.
all now or spreading it over 12 months.
Okay,
I'm not prepared to give you
thank you.
solid answers.
Councilmember Spector?
Thank you, I have my answer.
Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Derriere.
If I might just add a little more clarification, because we've had several speakers now dialogue about dollar cost averaging with the council. In the staff memo, we do advocate dollar cost averaging, because there's two concepts going on here. First, there's deploying the money to make sure that we either get the interest savings associated with deploying additional capital, we get contribution relief with deploying additional capital, but then all of this is happening under the backdrop that these are still assets that are invested in the marketplace. And so generally from a best practice perspective, 8 million, 8.6 million is over 10% of assets, whether we're talking about the miscellaneous plan or the safety plan. That would be considered a pretty good infusion of assets. So we would recommend working, if the decision is to give the money to CalPERS, we would work with Bartel to identify the amortization bases. In the example they gave, I believe on the long-term amortization basis, there were really two of them, and let's just say they were roughly about 4 million apiece. I think one was 5 and one was 3 something. We would probably say from a dollar cost averaging perspective, let's pay one of those bases now. Maybe we wait 6 months, maybe we wait 12 months. From CalPERS' perspective, they don't care. They will take money from us and pay bases at any point throughout the year. And then we pay another base, and then we do that until the money is extinguished. And so staff is definitely an advocate of dollar cost averaging. Because of the way the bases are, it isn't something we would do on a monthly basis. We would probably pay one base, and then as I mentioned, we would think about maybe 6 months later, 12 months later, then pay another base.
Councilmember Spector?
Thank you. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying you would do the dollar cost averaging, put X amount in immediately, X, Y amount in 6 months, 12 months, because because the stock market might go up and you want to get that benefit? Or the stock market might go down and you won't get the benefit?
Exactly. I would say we would recommend dollar cost averaging because we don't know what the market's going to do. And so what you try to do is you try to get exposure at different points in time in the hope that over the long term it all averages out, that we actually ended up getting a good entry point. What I would suggest is an infusion of over 10% of assets would be considered a pretty good size infusion for a single market entry point. And we would probably not advocate that.
But what is the significance of a large infusion? I mean, I understand what you're talking about in dollar cost averaging. Stock market might go up, stock market might go down, but if you put that component aside, what is significant to you of putting $8 million in?
So when you start discussing actuarial valuations, they're theoretical, and they use terminology that some of us cling to. And one of the phrases we cling to is the concept that somehow we're paying interest. And actually, Mr. Tinsley hit on it once in a finance committee meeting. Even though it's referred to as interest, what they're actually referring to is that we're missing assets. And so while from an actuarial perspective, theoretically, they calculate what they think the amount of assets we may need are, and then they say, well, you're missing X amount of assets, and therefore you have an unfunded liability. And then they extrapolate further and say, well, because you're missing those assets, you should still be paying the interest on it. But it's really a recognition of the fact that we're deficient in assets. And so how do you cure that deficiency? You give assets to CalPERS, and then CalPERS takes those assets, and they have their big asset allocation that's referred to as the PERF fund. That allocation has equities at the current valuations today. We've had a long economic expansion. Could the market go higher? Yes. Could it go lower? Historically, it tends to. When that's going to happen, nobody knows. But what we would recommend is that you try to get different exposures at different market valuations so that you're not subject to a single valuation. And so that's why we advocate that. I hope I answered your question.
Councilmember Sayak.
Thank you. Okay, so I understood paying off specific bases and following the dollar cost averaging that you mentioned. So 2 questions. In the scenario that you're envisioning, and you may not have the answer tonight, how much time do you anticipate utilizing the $8.2 million? And then the second question is, would you utilize the $3 million that's sitting in our general fund first? Or would you use a combination of both, or would you use the PARS 115?
So I generally don't like speaking off the top of my head, but I'll take a shot at it. I do agree that currently we have assets that have equity exposure. Those assets currently have a higher equity exposure than if we were to move the money to CalPERS. And so in that regard, from my perspective, we would be reducing the risk of those assets, especially if this committee were to say, yes, we no longer want those assets in PARS. If that is the direction staff's provided, then we would not want those assets exposed to the equity levels they're currently exposed to. So we'd probably take the PARS money, we would probably recommend to take the PARS money first and move that into CalPERS. Because the other money that the council just, put forward budgetarily, that is sitting in a very low-risk fixed income portfolio within the town's operating portfolio. So I would probably recommend moving the assets that are exposed to equity first.
And if I may, the first question, again, what's the scenario of time that you're anticipating? Because in the staff report, you mentioned dollar cost averaging, but you don't necessarily have a time frame. Whereas we've heard immediate, we've heard a year. Roughly, what are you anticipating, or whoever was anticipating that created the staff report?
I would say the first payment could happen 0 to 6 months, and the next payment 6 to 12 months. So somewhere in the 0 to 18-month time range. I'm not necessarily advocating 2 years. I'm definitely not advocating all at once. We would make a first payment to an amortization base, working with Bartel, and then 6 months to 12 months out, we could make another one. The Finance Committee previously, just to put it in perspective, when they had $4 million, they wanted the dollar cost average to $4 million over the course of a year, so they were putting roughly $400,000 per month in. We're talking something, 2x that, 2 times that, but somewhere in the 0 to 18-month time range.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Andrews, you and I were just talking about the dollar cost averaging and the reason that it is could be seen as a reasonable process. The question would be then, there are people who do not necessarily advocate for dollar cost averaging, advocate for putting all the money in at one time. What is your understanding, if you have one, of why that would be advantageous?
It would be advantageous if it were going to happen routinely every year. So if I thought this council were going to embrace putting $8 million per year to the problem, then I know I've got $8 million going in sequential over 12-month timeframes. And to me, that's a rational approach to dollar cost averaging. If we currently have $8 million without any known expectation of when there will be additional money, then to me that looks like a pretty large infusion of cash, and so we should try to get different points of market exposure.
Councilmember Sayak.
Okay, so then, following that line, Mr. Tinsley had recommended 4 very specifics, and 3 and 4 were looking forward at large sums for future infusions. Should that policy be decided first before deciding whether or not to average, what are we talking, dollar cost averaging?
So the reality is, budgetarily, this council has committed about as far as they can with ongoing funds, which was moving from a 30-year amortization to a 20-year and some of the other actions you've taken. To know forward-looking what you might be able to commit to from being able to utilize surplus funds at the end of a budget year, that I think is a little less known. I would say that, once again, while nobody knows the future, the 10-year projections we have show that we will need additional monies each year for probably the next 5 years to a decade. And so in that regard, Mr. Tinsley is right. We need to keep thinking about additional funds. In your report, there's 2 charts that actually show what if CalPERS were 6% tomorrow? What would this council have to do budgetarily if we immediately went to 6%? And I believe Joe from Bartell kind of took the delta between those 2 lines, and coincidentally, it would equal that we would have to budget about another $8 million a year. And so I think while nobody knows exactly what the data is going to be, the data we have before us now says we will probably need to consider additional funding in the future. We just don't know what that is.
And if I may, Mr. Mayor, just add that tonight, you don't need to make future actions. Really, this is the Oversight Committee that needs to make a decision about the $8.6 million tonight. And future council, when you sit and convene as the town council, we can have future budgetary conversations about this. But the Oversight Committee is really limited to how do you wish to invest the funds that the council has assigned for this purpose.
And from a process standpoint, we're still in the public comment speaking and still have one more speaker.
And that's where I would like to get back to. Vice Mayor, did you have a question?
I did, but it can wait.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Delier. Mr. Jack Von Naden.
I want to thank Mr. Andrews for answering the questions that he answered.
Duly noted. This is the last speaker card we have. Jack Von Naden, if anybody else wants to speak, please turn in a card.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, and council members. Before I start my speech, I can barely balance my checkbook, but it seems to me that if we leave the money in a 1.7% account, wouldn't we be better off dumping the money into CalPERS and saving ourselves 7%? There's probably a long, extended answer to that, but that's just my thought sitting there. If you had a chance to read my memo, I advocate that we use the 6% discount rate that CalPERS is moving towards. To not do so would be ignoring a huge problem, much like we looked at the other way, much when we looked the other way with the OPEB debt, when it was nothing but a $10 to $11 million footnote. We should acknowledge that pension debt is really $83 million, and with OPB at about $14 million, we owe the employees about $97 million. Interest costs on miscellaneous, safety, and OPEB are about $13.5 million every year. That's a staggering amount of money in my book. Interest is money that could have been spent on town improvements, paid salaries, hired police, and we could have hired police to direct beach traffic. The OPEB funded status has increased 12.1% points. On the other hand, the funded pension liability for miscellaneous has only gone up 1.4% percentage points, but has fallen from 76% funded in 2014 to 69% today. I do not subscribe to the 115 plan, as its investments are not that much different from CalPERS, who is substantially larger and has a much longer history of investment successes. CalPERS, for all its travails, has survived the two big downturns, the 2001 dot-com bust and the 2008 Great Recession. On the other hand, the current 115 investment fund has not had to suffer any severe setbacks and has only been making investments while investing in the longest bull market in history. With investment fees of just under 0.5%, the 115 plan starts out at a disadvantage to CalPERS every year. And last, we need to eliminate the opportunity of future councils to exercise the fungibility of money, spending on personal projects rather than paying down pension debt. I also do not subscribe to the notion that the state will bail out towns. It hasn't happened yet, and with over $70 million in the bank, there is no sound reasoning that the state would ever bail us out. My opinion, the best thing that we can do to improve the financial position of the town will be to pay the $8.2 million directly to CalPERS. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Von Neda. Is there any questions? I'll ask you a question. So there's been much discussion, as you've heard, about paying down CalPERS, bailing out the organization. I'm going to start with that one. I don't look at it in terms of bailing out specifically Los Gatos. I look at it like CalPERS would get into a jam, and then, as Mr. Tinsley stated, there would eventually become enough political pressure where the program of CalPERS would be there would be some work to rectify the problems, finally. And I look at that as being a state problem. I look at the Opeb as being a Los Gatos problem. So in your letter, you mentioned that we're kind of coming out of the woods with Opeb. We've increased our funded status on that one. But if the council were to put the money towards Opeb and gamble that someday that the state would eventually, inevitably, have to bail out CalPERS as a whole. Could the town not use the savings that we would be putting the money towards the Opeb on an annual basis to put the additional ADPs towards CalPERS? And would that make financial sense?
Complicated question to me. My gut feel is, as Mr. Tinsley said, I think there is probably some potential that the state will negotiate with the unions. The unions seem to be the big problem. And I would think that they would negotiate with the unions kind of across the board. So it would affect Los Gatos, it would affect Chico equally. They may reduce something completely, they may reduce it by 1%. I do not see any potential for the state bailing out all the cities. I don't see any potential for them bailing out specific cities.
So again, I think we're all bound by the same rules at the state level with the CalPERS, but internally we control our own Opeb trust. So do you see an advantage to addressing what we have in-house first and then waiting or biding time while applying the savings from addressing what we have internally first and paying that little bit of extra money that we're saving here towards CalPERS and then applying future monies towards CalPERS as a strategy? Nobody has brought up that strategy. All the speakers tonight say, eliminate the 115, put all the money towards CalPERS. There was some discussion at our meeting about, and I saw it in some correspondence about, we have a cancer and we have a cold. OPEB's a cold, CalPERS is a cancer. So do you try to treat the cancer and eventually the cancer wins, or do you try to just take care of the cold and we're cured of the cold at least?
From what I know, we are making headway against OPEB. So we are going to be getting that into the 75-77% funded range. I don't know a good number of years, but let's say 5 to 7 years. So we're making progress there. Whereas with CalPERS, I'm with the crowd. I'm with the herd there. Let's pay it into CalPERS. They're there forever. There's not going to be any negotiation on an individual basis. We're going to get whipped around by whatever the state comes up with, and hopefully they are able to negotiate with unions to make the pension plan more reasonable to towns and cities.
All right, thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. That concludes our public comments. We'll move to discussion and/or motion. Vice Mayor, you've been very patient.
Thank you. It's not a motion. I just wanted to ask some basic questions just to make sure that my understanding is correct before we go forward on the discussion. So the first one is that Ms. Pravetti pointed out that we tonight are just determining how to invest particular monies that have been set aside by the council, correct?
That's correct.
And we are not making any budget decisions for this year or next year or the year after.
That is correct.
That said, is there a $1 million allocation to Opeb that's embedded into our budget assumptions?
I'm going to defer, and I believe the answer is
Nodding.
yes.
Mr. Conway is nodding at me.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So those are two things. The next thing is, would you please summarize quickly and easily what are the component parts of the $8.2 or $8.6 million that we are discussing, and where do they currently reside, and what is their investment plan and return?
Thank you. So currently, there's approximately $5 million in what's referred to as the PARS 115 Pension Trust. Those monies are invested in their highest equity allocation because when they were invested, it was perceived the monies would stay there in perpetuity. It's roughly 70% equity. Their year-end performance, which was in the consent calendar, I believe, was roughly 5.92 on the year. They generally perceive with their capital market assumptions that they should have returns higher than that. But in the previous year, they did not.
Okay, so that's $5 million. Where's the rest of it?
Then, in the last budget cycle, the council set aside an additional $3.2 million to put towards additional payment strategies yet to be identified that may occur this evening. And so those monies are in what's referred to as the town's operating portfolio, which is invested in very low risk fixed income, earning approximately 2%.
And the $400,000 is earnings off of both of those repositories of money or one of those repositories of money?
So the $400,000, and once again, I might need to defer to the finance director, it is to move us from a 30-year amortization to a 20. I believe we did identify PARs for those monies to go to.
Well, my question was actually, we started out with 8.2. You said it might be more like 8.6 because there's $400,000 out there. I assume that was earnings that we made. Or is that additional monies that the council has set aside?
Additional monies. Last year, this body approved a recommendation that came out of the Finance Committee to effectively write a policy that would force us to internally move from a 30-year amortization to a 20, because CalPERS only made their change prospectively, not retroactively. We thought it was prudent to also try and force a retroactive change. And when we worked with the CalPERS actuaries, they estimated that to do that change, it would be approximately $400,000 a year. And so each year, we work with the CalPERS actuaries to see, okay, how much would we need to do this year? It's going to be approximately $400,000. Those monies, I don't believe have transferred to PARS yet. Correct. So that's why they're not necessarily in the staff memo, but I just wanted to let folks know that there is going to be, through policy, previous policy, an additional $400,000.
And one final question. If this body, I'm not going to say the council, if the Opeb Oversight Committee determines this evening where it wants to put various funds, and it can do that, no problem. Does the Opeb Oversight Committee have the power to shut down a fund, or is that a council decision that has to be made later?
I will start the answer, and then I'll defer to both the town manager and the town attorney. The PARS account was established prior to this body, well, the concept of the PARS account was initiated prior to this body, but when this body was adopted, it was to have the fiduciary role of overseeing those assets, and I would even say those vehicles. I mean, once again, I'll defer, but I think this body, if through your direction, you said this is how we think is the most appropriate way to invest these funds, and if part of that decision meant there's no longer a need for PARS, I would think you would have the authority to do that here, based on the resolution.
Okay, everybody's nodding.
We could do some research on it, but I think you'd have that ability to do that.
Well, I just wanted to make sure, but I understand that this was developed, this committee was developed as part of the 115 oversight. So I was just curious whether this committee had the power then to dissolve the trust fund that it is overseeing. And that was my earlier question, and remain extant.
It's probably the city council that gave the authority to create the OPEB.
Right.
So they would have the authority also to rescind that action.
So that could be a consent item if this committee made that recommendation, it would come back to council, sitting in your council capacity, you would determine if, in fact, you wanted to follow that recommendation, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of questions. You said you referenced the 5.92% return on the trust, the 115 trust. That was inclusive or gross of the fees that were charged. Do you know what the percentage return is when those fees are reduced or deducted?
I believe net of fees is probably roughly another 35 basis points. Yeah.
So what does that, in non-accounting brains, the 5.92% becomes what?
Roughly, I'd say 5.75.
Okay.
No, wait, sorry. We said 5.92, 5.57.
Okay. Thank you. And then, as part of what we're doing this evening, should this body be saying, yes, X amount of money, and we will do dollar cost averaging, or X amount of money and we won't do dollar cost averaging? I mean, are you looking to us to make a decision that includes a up or down on the dollar cost averaging?
I would say as much direction as can be provided would be preferable from a staff perspective. I mean, ideally, the first thing we'd like to know is there one of the three options available that this body thinks is the most reasonable way to put these assets to work? The staff recommendation is to do dollar cost averaging. I don't know if we need to define necessarily what that means, but it would be helpful if a motion were to be no dollar cost averaging or with dollar cost averaging. If we want to provide that additional clarity, I think that would be good.
Councilmember Sayoc.
Actually, that was the question I had of staff in terms of process. The actions before us here are pretty general, and so I wanted to know how definite and how detailed you wanted. And second question to that, this 400,000, do we also need a specific motion on that, or whenever this decision up there is made, that gets folded into it?
This would be folded under the current blanket of just what type of additional discretionary payment strategy do you want to pursue.
Okay.
And that means all current policy directives will be geared towards
Got it.
that strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Unless a future policy gave a different direction, but for purposes of this meeting, we would perceive that direction to mean this is how you want existing and current monies for pension mitigation to be utilized.
Go with the Vice Mayor and then Councilmember Rennie.
Just kind of a follow-up on what form the direction would take. If the council hypothetically were to say, we believe that $5 million should go into CalPERS, would a motion or direction be sufficient that would be something like to be invested over X period of time at the discretion of staff and in conjunction with the Finance Committee on to long bases or short bases or whatever, versus every, dollar cost averaging is pretty vague in my mind, but so what would it look like?
So I would say I think from a finance committee perspective, their next meeting wouldn't be until October. And so to the extent that this body feels they have sufficient information to provide even more clarity, so short base versus long base, the trade-off there is, do you want current reduced contributions but less interest savings? Or are you more interested in getting more interest savings over the life of the liability and slightly less contribution relief now? If this body is capable of giving that additional clarity, that would be great. In terms of dollar cost averaging, you've heard staff's recommendation, which is we're not talking about, something extensive. We're really saying we're only going to be able, if it's long bases, we're really only going to be able to pick probably 2 bases that would extinguish the entire 8 million. And we would say we can invest one relatively soon, 0 to 3 month timeframe probably, and then we would seek to do the other one in the 3 to 12 month timeframe. And so we're just looking for a little bit of latitude there. If that's something that would be agreeable in terms of an emotion, then that extra clarity would help too.
Councilmember Rennie?
Thank you. I have sort of 3 sets of questions. So the first one, I understand that you talked to CalPERS about a lump sum payment, and they advised against that. Why would they say that? So and the second part of the question, of my first question, second part is, what do they think is a lump sum payment when they said that they thought that was not a good idea?
So I don't want to speak for CalPERS, nor do I want to characterize a phone conversation that happened between the finance director and one of their representatives. But what I will say is the reason CalPERS is reducing their forward projections of what they think they're going to earn, that's because they feel most of the valuation in the market has already been achieved. They don't think there's a lot more forward valuation. And so I would say the organization as a whole is pretty risk adverse right now. And so they themselves are actually talking about creating a new asset class, well, newer for them, that would hold a pretty good amount of cash. They're actually talking about somewhere in the vicinity of 0 to 5% because they want what's referred to as dry powder, because they think a turn in the market is inevitable. Whether they're right or wrong, I don't know. But they're positioning themselves in a defensive posture. And I think that's reflected probably in any comments they may have made about whether or not this is a good time to enter into the market.
And so the second part of that is, what is a lump sum payment? They mean don't pay anything more than we're requiring, or don't make a large lump sum? What did that mean?
They refer to a lump sum as anything other than the annual required contribution. In our case, we're discussing somewhere in the vicinity of $8 million, and we're discussing doing it through paying down amortization basis.
Okay, let me ask a different set of questions. So you said CalPERS had a plan to reduce the discount rate towards 6% when they made extra money. Then when they made, in a year when they had more return than their discount rate, they would then reduce the discount rate. Doesn't that mean really what they're doing is not adding to the unfunded pension liability at the times that they reduce below 7%?
Correct. It's referred to, and Joe, jump in if you need to, but it's referred to as buying down the liability. When you have extra dollars, you buy down a portion of the liability, which doesn't expose your stakeholders to additional contribution volatility.
So we could, I think I saw on the slide, over 20 years, so they could get to 6% without adding any additional unfunded liability to us then?
They could. Now, granted, most of what is projected in these slides, and Joe, I will defer to you, is the 50% probability. There's a lot of variability around whether or not they achieve the 50% probability. Using scenario analysis, which is how Bartel and others try to project into the future, they run, a sequence of 1,000 iterations, maybe 2,000 iterations, and they come out with what the median outcome was. Under a median outcome scenario, they will ultimately get to 6% because in years where there's been a little bit of gain, they lower it, but then there will still be years where there's losses. I don't necessarily think it was intended to reflect what an unfunded liability might look like. It was more, please, Joe. It was more to show that they feel that through scenario analysis, ultimately CalPERS, through their own policy, will get to 6%.
And so the follow-on really is, we won't add unfunded during those years, they're moving it down, but we will add unfunded in the years that they fall short of the 6%, correct?
I believe that's a correct statement. And so, for instance, in years where we had abnormal gains and that would increase our funded status, they're going to take a portion of that ability to increase our funded status and use it to buy down the discount rate.
And I misspoke, I should have said below whatever the current discount rate is, we'll add, rather than 6%, it's 7, and then whatever it's, so when they add that on, it gets added in a, I don't know what the right term is, a tranche, that has some payment period, I guess, which is now 20 years. So we'll start, whenever some new unfunded is added, we start, I think it actually takes a couple years before they make us start paying it, right? And then it goes for 20 years. So we now have a new layer that goes 20 years out. And so the follow-on questions, tell me if I'm wrong, if not, I'll just keep going. As we add more of those, we've seen in the past this peak where at some point out in the future, our payments go up, 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 and then at some point in the future, they'll start going down. But every time we add one of these unfunded tranches, we actually push the peak further into the future. Is that correct?
Please, Joe.
Push the peak of what?
Well, so if you didn't show it tonight, but we've seen it. Our pension contributions are going up. There was a graph where you showed it going up, but if you look even longer term, that shows it eventually coming back down and everything paid off. And my question was, so we could look at the current forecasted peak and know when we're going to hit the top and start coming back down. But the question is, if we're adding unfunded liability every year that we don't make the discount rate, aren't we pushing the peak further into the future?
Yeah, our projections include that. So in the years that CalPERS gets more than 7%, they're going to hold on to some of that and use that to reduce the discount rate. But it's not free to the agencies, because normally you would have seen a lower contribution with that excess return, and you're not going to see that lower contribution. You're just going to see the discount rate being lowered and the contribution pretty much not changing. But in the years you don't get 7%, yes, you'll be adding layers, additional layers. Now, the graph that you saw us project does include 1,000 trials of, some of them are above 7 and some of them are low 7. So the ones above 7 brought down the discount rate eventually to 6. The ones that are below 7 increased the contribution, spread it over 20 years. And you see it coming down. Now, I don't know if anyone believes CalPERS contributions are going to come down, because in the past, things always happened to change that. They changed their demographic assumptions. In August, Wilshire told CalPERS they expected returns even to be lower than they used in their analysis to come up with a 7. So that might impact what CalPERS does the next time they do a review of the capital market assumptions next year.
So if I could come back to staff for another question. You mentioned the possibility, if we told you to put money into CalPERS, of paying off the certain tranches, and there was, in the presentation, we talked about long terms and short terms, and there's probably some medium terms. If I said to you in a motion, we want to put X amount of money in, but I want you to manage the peak, what would that mean to you in terms of choosing which tranches to pay off?
So in the report and in the presentation, there are graphs that illustrate kind of the different slope and arc of the various scenarios. It shows what a current payment schedule would look like, and then if we were to give money either to short bases or long bases, whether short base or long base, it will do a parallel shift down, and so you will have contribution relief to some extent. And so when you say managing the peak, I believe you're talking about that crest, where we're based on current projections, we kind of show a cresting of the liability and then eventually starting to go down gradually. And so in both scenarios, that crest will take a parallel shift down and you will get contribution relief. If you do longer bases, you'll get slightly less contribution relief, but you'll get a magnitude more of interest savings. If you do short amortization bases, you will get greater contribution relief, but you will get less interest savings over the course of the $8 million that you expend.
So my understanding is a little different than what you just said. Let me try to tell you why, and you can tell me where I'm wrong. So if we pay off a short duration, and I think there's some in our portfolio that are 6 or 7 years, if we were to pay those off, it would have no effect on the curve further out because that tranche doesn't have a contribution to payments at year 15, year 16, year 17. So in other words, that's why I say managing the peak. If we pay off the short term, you're not managing your peak. You're getting your money back before we get to the point where our payments per year are the largest. And if you pay off, let's say, the longest term ones, you're now, yes, moving the whole curve down, but you're moving the tail down instead of making a bigger movement in the middle. So for example, if we paid something that was a medium term that's just beyond the peak, you would move the peak down, but you wouldn't move the payments much further in the future, which are smaller, which we care less about. This is my understanding. Am I wrong?
I'm going to say I believe so, with all due respect, but I'm also going to defer to Joe if he thinks I'm wrong. But I believe if you turn to page 52 in the packet, and when I refer to pages, I'm referring to the square box in the bottom left-hand corner that has a gray infill and then a page number there. I'm not referring to slide numbers. So in the bottom left-hand corner of each page in the packet, there should be a page number, and I'm referring to page 52. If it's not readily available, we can get it up on the overhead, perhaps?
Yeah, and for those of you following the slides, it would be slide 19 and slide 20. Slide 19 shows the CalPERS contributions. It's got short bases, the contribution impact, and the interest savings, and then the bottom graph are the CalPERS contributions that show the peak.
So out on this slide, let's look at where it says year 34, well, maybe a little, let's go to 39, 40. In that case, the curve is much lower. But if you pay off a tranche that ends in 2030, you make no difference on the amount of payment further out.
If I understood your question, council member. If I understood your question, council member, I thought you were inferring that between a short base and a long base, one of them would not impact the current. And so what this slide illustrates, the green line is the current schedule, and you can see whether you look at the dotted long base approach or the solid red line short base approach, both of them are significantly below the current crest, the current arc, and so you do get relief during the periods that I think you're referring to using either strategy.
So if I paid off a tranche that ended in 25, 26, it's going to give relief in 28, 29?
Correct. So 28, 29 is right here. The difference is if you look at paying off the short base, and this is why you don't continue to get interest savings on a short base, it eventually aligns perfectly with the current. Whereas by targeting a long base, you continue to see savings, and most of those savings are associated, I believe, with the interest savings. Joe gave me a nod. So that's why, from a staff perspective, we're comfortable with almost any strategy chosen. When we move to implementation, and it's stated in the staff memo, we will definitely have recommendations on implementation, but I think a short-based strategy versus a long-based strategy is a policy decision in the sense that you're determining, do you want greater interest savings or do you want greater contribution savings? Both strategies will give you contribution savings even through the crest period, the current crest period. The longer-based strategy will ultimately give you more interest savings.
Okay, that's it for my question.
So you mentioned you're talking to CalPERS about reamortizing unfunded over 20 years.
I'm sorry, say that again?
You mentioned that you spoke to CalPERS about reamortizing the unfunded over 20 years and getting rid of the different bases. So does that imply there might?
We're not doing it through getting rid of different bases. We were doing it through sequestering additional dollars in the PARS account.
By not restarting the amortization in 20 years?
No, theoretically, we would be saving enough money that 20 years from now, we would have enough money to pay off the remaining 10 years of what would have been a 30-year amortization.
Okay, good. Because I was thinking if you...
It was a capital accumulation strategy. And
if
as much as I like you, Joe, I think we should stick with questions from the committee as opposed to you and I having a dialogue.
Well, thank you, Mr. Andrews. I mean, I'd like to ask the question because I remember when Councilmember Spector and I were on the Finance Committee several years back, we had something like a $30 million unfunded liability, and we asked Mr. Conway at the time if we could treat it like a 30-year mortgage versus a 15-year mortgage or something to that effect. And then we kind of arrived at a 20-year payment plan would be better. And it was my understanding that by contributing at that time $300,000 extra every year, that we would take that 30-year plan and turn it into a 20-year plan, which was of the understanding that that number would be essentially paid in full with the actual payments, and then the additional payment we were adding, it would have been quote-unquote amortized. Now, since that time, they've been adding every year to our unfunded pension liabilities, so you're kind of, even though you make the payment, it grows, and it's like making the minimum credit card payment and then charging more every month, using Mr. Tinsley's analysis. So I guess at this point in time, that's kind of a moot point in the sense that we're not really looking at a 20-year payoff of any kind, even by adding the extra 300 or 400,000, whatever we're talking about.
The only reason staff even mentioned the shorter amortization policy was just to acknowledge that there could be an additional 400,000. It's really, it's already set policy. Staff will continue to implement that policy separate from this. What it will do for us, though, is when there are additional monies, it does mean we will probably put them in whatever directive this committee tells us, as opposed to what we're currently doing.
And right now, we're currently putting that into the 115. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Vice Mayor?
So this is not a question, and nor is it a motion. It's just recognizing that it's almost 20 to 7, and I just wanted to give the council some high-level comments that where I was going. So where I'm going, and let's see where other people are, is I would like to use the 8.2 million and put it to CalPERS. I would like to use the 5 million first because Mr. Andrews indicated it's in a more high-risk account, and we would like to get it out of there, and where we have the 3.2 in a more stable, albeit low-earning type of investment situation. I am totally fine with eliminating the 115 trust for the reasons that have been stated by the various speakers, and I would be inclined to pay off longer bases, not shorter bases. With respect to how the money gets invested and when, I'm completely comfortable with leaving that to staff as long as we have an investment period that we're defining.
Councilmember Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Ms. Jensen. I would ask staff, would you please put up the motion that you anticipated from us, the simplistic motion? All right, thank you. I am going to make a motion, but before I do that, I just want to explain that when I went into our last Finance Committee meeting, I did not go in thinking, well, I want to get rid of the 115 trust, or I want to keep the 115 trust. I want to pay directly to CalPERS. I don't want to pay directly to CalPERS. But it was a great meeting for me because the individuals who are on that committee, who are not council members, had a great discussion, and by virtue of that discussion, where I came to appreciate was that the one of the reasons for having the 115 trust was that it would gain assets for the town, and those assets could be used to pay off our unfunded liabilities. Because it was a high-risk 115 account, it would need time to accumulate its assets. And then when there were committee members who were real staunch supporters of the 115 trust. However, when the realization that this council or a council could or could not keep the 115 trust for that extended period of time, be it 10 years or longer, then those individuals shifted to placing the money directly into the CalPERS account. And so it was because of that discussion and that insight that I too, at that meeting, supported the monies being paid directly to CalPERS. So with that background for myself, my motion will be that we do the payments directly to CalPERS, that we recommend the following ADP strategy, and I may or may not be getting all of the components. I'm sure staff or somebody will tell me. This motion would include the longer bases. This motion would include the monies from the 115 trust being paid to CalPERS. This motion is not going to, at this juncture, have a recommendation on the monies that are currently not in the 115 trust, other than the fact that they should be paid directly to CalPERS. So at this point, that is the totality of my motion. And if it gets a second, and if other folks have other components, I would be glad to entertain them.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. I have a question for the maker. So Councilmember Spector, does your motion include keeping the 115 trust open, but using all the money in the 115 trust to apply towards CalPERS, according to how staff thinks is the best way to apply it through dollar cost averaging?
My motion includes not keeping the 115 trust.
So you would like to completely shut it, even though the funds could be drawn down to zero, and eliminate the tool that could potentially be used later if perhaps that becomes, because, well, I'm not debating.
The answer is yes, I am saying shut down the 115 trust.
And I would,
As the seconder, that was my understanding, that it would be shutting it down. And if I could ask a question, Mr. Schultz, before he finishes, the council can reinstate a 115 trust at any time it chooses, correct?
there are startup costs with doing that, but that's not on your agenda to completely shut down.
Right, so it's a recommendation that's contained in this motion.
We can come back with you with the benefits and the objections to that if there are any.
Okay, so that's my understanding as a seconder.
Thank you for the clarification. Councilmember Rennie?
I'd like to request an addition to the motion. I think we should put a time frame on it. I'm suggesting that this, the 8.2 be put in over the next 18 months. If that's too long, I would settle with 12, but I think, as Mr. Anger taught, there's the whole discussion about dollar cost averaging. I think we're leaving it a little vague if we don't say, give it some time frame or some dollar per 6 months or something of that sort. So I would request that the 8.2 is completed over the next 18 months.
This maker of the motion is not going to include that component, and that's because we have had testimony that the monies should be paid immediately and directly to CalPERS. We have had testimony or information from staff that not quite clear to me, that sort of does not agree with that. So I'm not going to include an 18-month component in my motion.
So, question of staff, so what does that mean to you? Does that mean go do it right away, or what does that mean to you?
if the motion, as it's currently on the floor, does not have a time horizon, then I will assume, like in most policy decisions, you defer to staff to administer it how we see fit.
Councilmember Spector? Is that, okay. Any other comments?
Well, no, I'm thinking.
So what she's thinking, I'll comment.
I have, I'll take the floor, though.
Okay.
When I'm concerned about a motion that says that staff will administer it as they see fit, because I am concerned about an extended period of time.
Staff is on the record as saying we think this would occur within a 0 to 18-month time frame, with probably the first ADP payment happening between 0 and 3 months, just based on administratively working with Bartel and CalPERS, and then the subsequent base, and the motion is currently discussing longer bases, with the next longer base being paid in the next 3 to 12 months. If for some reason the market were to mean revert tomorrow, the next base would be paid in the 3 to 3+1 day period. But all things being considered equal, if we are still functioning under a fairly rational market and it's exhibiting normal tendencies, first one within 0 to 3 months, and the second one within 3 to 12.
Within the context of that explanation, that is acceptable to me.
Okay, so as the seconder, wanted to clarify, and Councilwoman Spector help nod or something. I heard your motion as being deplete the 115, the 5 million in the 115 first, and then move to the 3.2, and then I heard you agree with Mr. Andrews that that was going to be done in the sequencing kind of discussion that he just presented. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Is that
Okay.
staff's
All right,
understanding?
so then I'll
That would be staff's understanding.
retain my second.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Rennie?
Thank you. So thank you for adding that piece to the motion, because that was critical to me. I was not going to support the motion with it as vague or as it seemed to be. And so I will support the motion, but I do want to say I'm a little disappointed that we are closing the 115. I realize we've all come to that, and I'm really disappointed because the reason we're closing it is we don't believe councils can be conservative enough with their money. When I look back, as far as I can see with councils, they've been nothing but careful with the money and trying to address pension liabilities. We paid off the $4.5 million side fund in 2014. We've been making Opeb payments before it was even fashionable to do those kinds of things. So as far as I can look back, the council has been very rational. So it's a little disappointing to me that the reason we're abandoning this is unrational councils. Los Gatos has usually done a pretty good job of picking overall rational councils. It's disappointing to me, or maybe it's not disappointing, maybe I believe that maybe that we go that direction because even the Finance Committee, which overwhelmingly supported setting up the 115 when we first made the recommendation, now overwhelmingly wants to get rid of it. So if the Finance Committee can't even stick with a 115, I guess then maybe councils can't either, or stick with when we pay, when we use the money. So in disappointment, I will be supporting the motion because that seems to be the way to go.
So I will weigh in. It is my understanding that we're not making a determination about closing the 115 at this point in time. We have agreed to deplete the 115, but we are going to be brought back further information about further action, about the costs associated with it, the features and the benefits of having it, whether or not there's any balance in it at any given time. We would still maintain it as a potential future tool in our toolbox. Is that a correct assumption?
And that would be a council decision.
So when would that be potentially a council decision? How would that go about? Would that be a recommendation through Finance Committee, or would that be
No.
an agenda item, or how?
No, this committee gave very clear direction, so then we would just do our necessary research, and we should have that ready for consideration either later on this month or early October.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments, or Councilmember Sayak?
Just stating for the record that I will be supporting the motion, and I just want to give thanks to everyone that participated in this very long and thorough discussion that we've been having over the past several months. It's a very serious subject that I know that many of our city colleagues, some of them are not even touching, and I feel very confident that the conversations, the multiple conversations we've had, has been in the best interest of the financial health of this town. So thank you.
Now, I weigh in one more time as well. I'd like to reiterate what Councilmember Sayak said, and also that the thinking has been evolutionary, as the numbers have been. At one point in time, we were talking about additional payments to pay it off, $300,000 a year, which I think is quite wishful at this point. We moved on to things like the 115 trust as being a potential answer to help us through the times when we were going to have those extra tough payments, when our town revenues looked like they were not going to be enough to make the payments. Now our thinking has evolved on that. I hope that someday the state of California will figure this out, because it's causing a lot of pain. I looked at the charts in our staff report, and you can see that in the early 2000s, there's two strategic blunders. One was, at one point in time, they've agreed to pay out way more money than they probably should have in the early 2000s, when they were 140% funded. And the other blunder was probably investing in real estate investment trusts or something in the late 2000s. And I think the whole state is feeling the pain. I'm hoping that there will be, at some point in time, we will be 140% funded again, but that doesn't appear to be on the horizon anytime soon. Therefore, we must go through these painful exercises at the local levels, and I wish the best for everyone working on that. With that said, all in favor of the motion? Aye. Opposed? None. It passes unanimously. We are adjourned. We will be reconvening at 7 for the regular meeting. Thank you.